Before all things, the eternal divinity of Jesus Christ. Key verse, Colossians 1:17. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Introduction. The question of Christ's nature. One of the most crucial questions in theology is, who is Jesus Christ? The answer determines whether Christianity is a mere moral philosophy or the ultimate truth about God. Colossians 1:17 provides a foundational answer. Jesus is before all things. This statement places him in the category of the uncreated, the eternal, a status reserved for God alone. Today we will examine the phrase "before all things" and its theological implications, address objections that argue Jesus is a created being, challenge skeptics with a question they cannot answer without affirming Jesus' divinity. Part 1. Unpacking before all things. The phrase "before all things" signifies temporal pre-existence. Jesus existed before anything created, including time itself. Genesis chapter 1:1 speaks of the beginning of creation, but John 1:1 goes further. In the beginning was the Word. The Word, Jesus, was already present when creation began. Time itself is a created entity. Genesis chapter 1:14-19. Jesus' existence before all things places him outside time in eternity. Ontological superiority. Jesus' nature is fundamentally distinct from creation. All things owe their existence to him. All things were made through him. John chapter 1:3. A creator cannot be part of what he creates. Revelation 22:13. Jesus declares, "I am the Alpha and the Omega," affirming his eternal, self-existent nature. Sustainer of creation. The verse continues, "In him all things hold together." Only a being with infinite power can sustain the universe, a role reserved for God. Part 2. Addressing objections from skeptics. Skeptics and non-believers often misinterpret Scripture to argue that Jesus is a created being. Let's analyze their claims. Objection 1. Jesus is the firstborn of all creation. Colossians chapter 1:15. Response. The Greek term prototokos translates to firstborn, but its meaning is rooted in preeminence, not origin. Example. In Psalm 89:27, God says of David, "I will make him the firstborn, the highest of the kings of the earth." David was not the first king, but he was the most preeminent. Paul clarifies this in Colossians 1:18, where Jesus is the firstborn from the dead, emphasizing his supremacy in the resurrection, not chronological order. Objection 2. Revelation 3:14 calls Jesus the beginning of God's creation. Response. The Greek word for beginning here is arche, which can mean origin or source. Revelation 3:14 affirms Jesus as the source of creation, not the first creation. Objection 3. Jesus is called the Son of God. Response. In biblical language, son of often signifies essence or nature, not origin. For example, sons of thunder, Mark 3:17, describes James and John's fiery nature. Jesus being the Son of God means he shares the same divine nature as the Father. Objection 4. Jesus was born of Mary, so he had a beginning. Response. Jesus' human nature began in time, but his divine nature is eternal. John 1:14 explains, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us." Philippians 2:6-7 describes this as the kenosis, the self-emptying of Christ, where he took on human nature without ceasing to be God. Part 3. The logical dilemma for skeptics. If Jesus is before all things, how can he be a created being? Logical consistency. To exist before all things, Jesus must exist before creation. By definition, a created being cannot precede creation. Therefore, Jesus is uncreated. The unanswerable challenge, skeptics. Explain how Colossians 1:17 can describe a created being as existing before all things. If Jesus is not God, he cannot be uncreated. If he is created, he cannot be before all things. Conclusion. Colossians 1:17 leaves no room for ambiguity. Jesus Christ is God, the uncreated creator. Final question to skeptics. If Colossians 1:17 states that Jesus is before all things and only God is uncreated, how can you deny that Jesus is God?